I want to remind you that we're in the middle of a season of prayer. From now until September 13th, we're going to be praying 4 things every day. The purpose of this is to get our minds back on track as a church body, to get our hearts together, united, that we would be of one mind. There's so much going on with pandemic, with a coming election, with not one but 2 tropical storms in the Gulf. Like it's like Oprah says, you know, you get a hurricane, you get a hurricane. But thanks. Yeah. You won't get an Oprah joke every Sunday, I promise you. But we can get distracted from our purpose. We as a church have a purpose. We have a vision. We have a mission to accomplish in our community. And as we pray over these things, my hope is that it will get our minds focused on that purpose. So we're praying every day for ourselves. Lord, show me how to make a difference in the lives of others. We're praying for our relationships. Show me the transforming relationships you want me to be a part of. We're praying for our church. Lord, use First Baptist Church to bring peace to the chaos in Montgomery County and around the world. And we're praying for our community. Lord, bless all those who are walking in darkness in our community and bring them into your light. And you get a daily email from me if you subscribe to it that has that prayer prompt on it along with a devotional. So if you haven't subscribed, you do that. And if you need help doing that, just let me know. But we're in Ruth chapter 2 tonight. Ruth chapter 2 and 3. When I was in seminary in the early to mid-90s, we lived in Fort Worth where my school was. My brother was a student at the time at Texas A&M. And I remember one weekend, I decided I wanted to go visit him. Now, at that time, my wife's parents were living in Brenham, which was pretty close to College Station. And so we thought, well, I'll go see him, and maybe they can pick you up in College Station, and you can go spend the weekend with them. So it was a great plan. We had to wait until Carrie got off work at 5 p.m. on Friday evening, and as soon as she got off, we left. I had told my father-in-law that I estimated it would take about 3 hours for me to get there. So they were going to meet us at 8 o'clock in the parking lot of a Walmart in College Station. And I saw from the map, there's really only one turn you have to make. You just head south on 35, and then you turn left at Waco, and it's a straight shot. So we set the cruise control. I won't tell you at what speed. We found some good music on the radio, and we just kicked back and enjoyed the ride. Got to Waco, made our turn. Everything was going great. But time was ticking. The sun was setting. It was getting closer and closer to 8, and I didn't see any signs for College Station. I started to get a little worried. I was thinking to myself, now, surely I couldn't mess this up. Even I could not mess this up. But where are the signs that say College Station straight ahead? And then we pulled into a little town called Hico, Texas, H-I-C-O. Now, I'd never been to Hico. I only knew 2 things about that town. Number one, it was the hometown of Mitch the Wild Thing Williams, who was a relief pitcher for the Phillies, who gave up the series-ending home run in the 1993 World Series to Joe Carter of the Toronto Blue Jays. Are you proud of me? The other thing I knew is that it was nowhere near College Station. So we pulled over. This is the early 90s. There were no cell phones, at least not that we owned. So we had to find a payphone. Remember those? And we had to figure out what is the phone number of the Walmart in College Station. As a side note, my in-laws were not exactly parking lot of the Walmart kind of people. Okay, I'm not calling them snobs, they're not, but they were used to a little nicer environs, so I was really starting to get nervous. So I found the number, I called the Walmart, I asked for the manager. I had to convince this manager that he had to go out into the parking lot and find these 2 people, specific people in a specific car, and pass along a message that said, it's going to be more like 11 o'clock than 8 o'clock, and then hope he did it. So we turned around, and sure enough, we got to town a little after 11 o'clock. And don't you know, my father-in-law had a lot of fun telling that story for years to come, but not as much fun as my brother. Now, I tell you all that to tell you this. God has a plan laid out for your life from before you're even born. Psalm 139 tells us that he crafts us in our mother's womb. He knows all the days that we will live before even one of them is to be. Ephesians 2:10 says, you are God's masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which he prepared ahead of time for you to do. And the way you live a life that's meaningful, the way you experience joy, fulfillment, the way you experience the life you were born to live is by following that path. And the way you experience devastation, disappointment, maybe some short-term success, but ultimate despair is by deviating from the path that God has laid out for you. It's as simple as that. Last week we saw in chapter 1 how this young woman, Ruth, born and raised in Moab, neighbor to Israel, born and raised worshiping different gods, this young woman, Ruth, said to her mother-in-law, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." And right there, that was Ruth taking a change of trajectory in her life. Her life had been headed along this path, and all of a sudden it was changed. Suddenly she was following the path of Yahweh, the God of Israel. But following the path of God is something you don't do in a one-time decision. We're Baptists, we're evangelical Christians. We're used to this idea that you walk an aisle, you pray a prayer, and that means you're in God's family. And I believe that with all my heart, that if you ask Jesus to be your Savior, you are forever. And that's true, but you can be a child of God and miss the plan of God altogether for this life. And many of us have done that. And many of us are doing that right now. Ruth had said yes to Yahweh, but her life wasn't going to get easier. It was going to get harder. She was going to face poverty of the kind she'd probably never faced before. She would face ostracism because now for the first time in her life she was an immigrant. She was living among people who spoke a strange language and had different customs and who would look at her with suspicion. She was someone who was a young woman, single in a world dominated by men with no protection. She was tasked with taking care of her mother-in-law who had given up on life. And that can be frustrating when you're trying your best to take care of someone who doesn't want to help themselves. And so the question is, will Ruth stay on the path of God? Or will she say, like the Israelites in Exodus, let's just go back home. Let's go back to Egypt. Let's go back to home where I know it was bad, it was slavery, but it's better than this. And the second question is, how do we stay on God's path? How do we continue to follow him? All right, so chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now, there's a couple of things going on here that don't make sense unless you know a little something about biblical culture. One of them is the idea of gleaning. You may remember last week, if you were here for last week or you listened to it online, we said that the last verse in chapter 1 was significant, even though it sounds insignificant. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, chapter 1, verse 22. And I said, remember those words because they're going to be important later on. Why are they important? Well, because of this idea of gleaning. What is gleaning? Gleaning was an actual law in the law of Moses, essentially the constitution of the nation of Israel, that said if you're a landowner, when it comes to harvest time, don't do what your instincts tell you to do. Don't do what business principles tell you to do, which is you go through that piece of property, that field of olives, of grapes, of grain, or whatever that happens to be. Go through it once, go through it twice, go through it 3 times until you know you've got every single bit of crop harvested. You don't want to waste any of it, right? That's what we would do. But the law of Israel said no, go through it once. Leave enough for the people who don't have land. God knew that even though when the Israelites came into the promised land, everybody got a plot of land, over time things would happen. A father would gamble his land away, or drink it away, or sell it to pay other debts, and a family would be left with nothing. If you were landless in that culture, in that agricultural economy, you had nothing. You had no way to take care of yourself. There was no social safety net. There was no Medicare. There was no food stamps. There was no welfare. And so God set up a principle that if you were poor, you just had to pay attention and find out when your neighbor was harvesting his crop, and you had to get yourself out there at exactly the right time so that you could walk behind the reapers and catch whatever they dropped or missed. And that was how you provided for yourself and your family. Now, like most of the laws of Moses, not all Israelites obeyed this. For instance, there's a whole chapter in Leviticus about the year of Jubilee. Once every 50 years, the Israelites were supposed to have this big year where everybody who had lost their land got their land back. Everybody who was in slavery would be set free. Everybody who had debts would have their debts canceled. You know that historians and scholars have said they've never found a single record of even 1 year of Jubilee being celebrated. So just because God said it in his law doesn't mean the Israelites did it. But Ruth happens to come to the field of a man named Boaz who's righteous enough, he's going to do what God says, even though it costs him, even though it's sacrificial. And she begins to follow these reapers. And that's another thing. Verse 3, I will read the second part of that verse again. She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. In Hebrew, it literally says it this way. Her chance chanced upon the field of Boaz. So remember last week I said there's no miracles in the book of Ruth. There's no times when God speaks out loud or does some audacious, overt miracle. But we see lots of moments where he's working behind the scenes. And this is one of them. She just happened to come to the field of Boaz. Why is that significant? Well, Elimelech was her father-in-law. Boaz is his relative. And here's another custom of ancient Israel that we need to be aware of. It was called levirate marriage. Levirate marriage was a custom that said if you were a widow and you had no sons, the closest male relative of your husband should take care of you. He should marry you. He should father children by you. Those children will be considered the sons of your dead husband, so his family line will not disappear. But even more significantly, you'll be taken care of, and when you're old, you'll have sons to care for you. Now again, this was a law not all Israelite men obeyed, because most Israelite men didn't want a widow. They wanted someone who was just theirs. They wanted sons who would bear their names. But Ruth comes to the field of a man who is eligible to be her redeemer. That is the term for someone who chooses to obey the law of levirate marriage. Okay? So Ruth is harvesting or gleaning in his field. She doesn't know anything about the family connections. She just knows this is the field she happened to come into. Boaz takes a look at her. Again, he doesn't know anything about the family connections either. He just sees this young woman, which is an unusual thing. Usually it's men gleaning. He sees her and says, now who is this? And they say, oh, that's Ruth the Moabitess. She's the daughter-in-law of Naomi. And he says, oh yes. He scratches his chin and says to himself, I remember hearing about her. That's pretty remarkable that a woman like that would leave behind her people and her gods and would come just to take care of her mother-in-law and to follow our God. She must be pretty remarkable. And so he takes his workers aside and he says, listen, let's be nice to this young lady. First of all, if any of you guys lays a finger on her, you're going to have to answer to me. Second of all, make sure she knows she can help herself to all the water she needs to drink. And when we're done at the end of the evening and we sit down to dinner, she's welcome to enjoy the feast. And by the way, when you're walking along, drop a little extra for her. And that's what they do. And so that night when Ruth gets home, Naomi says, my goodness, you said you were going to glean. I thought we'd have enough for a couple of dinner rolls. You've got a ton. How did that happen? She said, well, the guy whose field I gleaned in was named Boaz, and he was really nice. And she said, Boaz, well, he's one of our relatives. And Naomi's wheels start to turn. Wouldn't it be great if he would recognize his responsibility, his eligibility to be a redeemer? Wouldn't it be great if this landowning older man would look upon this young woman, this young widow, and say, I can be her redeemer? But guess what? The best laid plans of mice and men and nosy mothers-in-law don't always come to pass the way we think they will. Barley harvest lasted 7 weeks. At the end of 7 weeks, Boaz had not made a move. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a position where you said to yourself and to God, I am doing my best, Lord, to do your will. I'm doing all that I know to do. And your word says in Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you, and it's not being given to me. I don't see it, Lord. Where are your promises? Guy across the street runs around on his wife, and he just bought a new BMW. Where's my car? My boss is the meanest person I've ever met, and yet he keeps getting promoted, and I haven't gotten promoted once. Or maybe you're a kid in school who says, there's another kid in my school who makes my life miserable. He's just so mean. And yet all the adults think he's the greatest thing on earth. He wins every award the school has to give. Lord, it's not that I'm jealous. It's just I thought it was supposed to work a certain way where when we're faithful to you, you're faithful to us. And I just don't see that happening. Have you ever been there, waiting for Matthew 6:33 to kick in? What you need to understand is sometimes God's path leads through the valley of the shadow of death. Sometimes God's path leads through some difficult moments. And I can't tell you why. And I'm not sure we could understand if he tried to tell us why. But I do know the worst thing you can do is to walk off the path at that point. Because sometimes just when it looks darkest is when God is getting ready to do his best work. So look at chapter 3, verse 1. Barley harvest is ending. Naomi realizes her plan hasn't worked. It says, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor.'" All right, let me give you a little insight here too. The last stage of a harvest of grain is you thresh it. You take a fork and you throw it up into the air and the wind blows away the non-grain and you have nothing but heads of grain left. The threshing part was the easier work. You're in shade, you're in a little shelter sort of place. It was the end, and so it meant that you were at the end of a long period of hard work and it was time to celebrate. So as they would thresh, they would eat, they would drink, they would enjoy themselves. They'd lay down at night, go to sleep on the floor of that barn or that threshing floor. The next day they'd get up and they'd finish the threshing. So it's a time of celebration. Keep that in mind. She says, verse 3, "Wash therefore and anoint yourself and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking." Now I need to clarify something. For years when I would read this story, I thought what Naomi was doing was, let me tell you how to attract a man. You put on these clothes, you put your hair in this fashion, you do this, you do this. She was basically giving her, tips from an older woman to a younger woman. Let me tell you about men, honey, but that's not what's going on. This is not about seduction. And the reason I know that is there's a similar story in the book of 2 Samuel in which David is praying for an infant son who is sick. And he's praying, "God, if it be your will, please restore my son. Please don't take him away from me." But in the end, the child dies. And at that point, what does David do? He gets up, he washes his face, he anoints his hair, and he puts on his clothes. Same language that Naomi gives to Ruth. So what Naomi is saying to Ruth is not get all fixed up. She's saying take off your mourning clothes and put on regular clothes. She's saying it's time for you to let everyone know you've grieved for my son long enough. And now you're ready. Now you're ready to move forward. You're ready to receive a marriage proposal if that should be offered. It's as if she's saying, time to take off your wedding ring. All right? So, verse 4. "When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say I will do." And I know right now you're going, okay, Jeff, now you're saying this is not about seduction, but this sounds pretty, 50 Shades of Ruth to me. I don't know. So what's going on here? Well, I don't think there's the biblical word is hanky-panky. I don't think there's any of that going on because God would condemn that in his word. God's very clear about how he feels about that. So what I think is happening, I think Naomi is encouraging Ruth to make a suggestion to Boaz. What she's saying is, I don't know, ladies, if you found this to be true, men can be slow to pick up on our little hints. So you're going to have to make a little more aggressive hint. What you need to do is you need to show him that you need protection and that you look to him as someone you'd like to be that protector. And so tonight when he wakes up because his legs are cold and he looks down and he sees you, someone he knows, dressed in the clothing of an available woman, shivering in the cold, he's going to say to himself, she needs someone. Why can't I be that someone? But this is a very vulnerable position that Ruth is placing herself in. This is an opportunity for her to go from being seen as honorable to being a source of shame. This is an opportunity for her to miss out on the person who's been helping provide for her. If she embarrasses him, if he rejects her, it could turn out very, very badly. So what happens? Well, Ruth does exactly what her mother-in-law said. She uncovers his feet as he sleeps there by his pile of grain. And in the middle of the night, he wakes up with a start, sees Ruth laying there, and this is what he says. Look at verse 10 of chapter 3. May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. That says a lot, doesn't it? It says, the reason I haven't done anything is I just assumed that you wouldn't be interested in an old guy like me. But you've blessed my heart. You went after me when there's all these other young men. Verse 11. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you're a worthy woman. And now it's true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Now, isn't that great? But it's not the end of the story. And again, this tells us something about Boaz. See, according to the letter of the law, the male relative who was closest in relationship to Elimelech was the eligible redeemer. So Boaz could say, well, I don't care about all that. That's technicality. You're interested in me. I'm interested in you. Let's make this happen. But if he does that, and the closer relative raises a stink about it, it could again cause shame. It could again cause damage to the family name. He says, let's do this the right way. Tomorrow I'm going to go talk to this man. We'll settle this once and for all. The good news for Ruth is she knows now that Boaz is going to make sure that one way or another, she's taken care of. So, what was the key to Ruth staying on the path of God? And how do we stay on God's path? See, I'll tell you, and some of you know this about me, when I was a teenager and a young adult, I was very, very obsessed with the idea of knowing God's will. I used to read books about it. I used to think about it. I used to pray about it. Lord, show me your will. Show me your purpose. My idea was if I just knew God's will, I'd always make the right decision. If you always make the right decision, then you never suffer any problems, right? And the book that finally disabused me of that was Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby, where I found out, well, that's not really the way it works. God doesn't drop knowledge on you from the sky and give you a road map, like the map from Fort Worth to College Station. God says, no, get to know me. Get to know me, and then I'll show you the way. So what I realized at that point was my desire to know God's will, which I thought was a very righteous desire, was actually selfishness. It was, Lord, show me. Show me what you want me to do so I can experience happiness and joy and peace and fulfillment. What Ruth did was not focus on herself. I want you to think about this with me for a second. What was Ruth's whole motivation? Her whole motivation was, I've got to take care of Naomi. This poor woman's lost her husband and her 2 sons. She is bereft of any emotion. She literally cannot even take care of her own needs. I've got to take care of her. She's going to starve to death. That was her focus. Naomi, in the course of this story, changes her focus. She goes from being totally fixated on her own grief to saying, I've got this daughter-in-law who turns out to be a pretty special person. I'm going to try to find a husband for her while she's still young. And then there's Boaz. First of all, Boaz is a man who does what most other Israelites won't. He follows the law of God, allows gleaners into his field. He is willing to sacrifice to help the poor of Bethlehem. But also, he takes special interest in Ruth. And we know by the time we get to chapter 3, it's not because he's got some kind of ulterior motive. Ladies, not that men ever have ulterior motives, do we? But Boaz certainly doesn't. Because as he says, I assumed I was too old for you. He's just doing it to be kind. He's just doing it to say, here's somebody trying to take care of her mother-in-law. I'm going to help. So think about it. Here's 3 people who each make a decision to put their own needs aside for a moment and help somebody else. And if even one of those 3 had chosen to be selfish, this chain would have been broken. And the happy ending we're going to see next week would not have taken place. So I say to you, The key to knowing God's will, the key to staying on God's path is to keep your eyes on Him and other people. Kind of reminds you of something Jesus said, doesn't it? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. You don't need to know all 613 commands in the Old Testament, although if you do, good for you. You just have to follow those two, and everything's going to work out. If you just serve others in the name of Jesus, you're going to be on the path of God, and you're going to make right choices. So if I could go back and talk to my 16-year-old self, I'd say, stop asking what is your purpose in life. Stop asking what is God's will for your life. Just say every single day, who can I serve today? Who can I show the love of Christ to today? And if that's the way I wake up every morning, Lord, help me to make a difference in somebody's life today, and I actually follow through with it, then I'm on the path of God. And my decisions are a lot clearer because I'm in His will. I'm following His path. Now, why is that the key? Of all things, it's very counterintuitive, isn't it? Why would thinking of others and not yourself be the key to staying on the path of God? Because when you do that, you're actually living out the gospel. The most powerful witness you can possibly have is a selfless life. Why? Because when Jesus came into this world, He was the only person in human history who was completely righteous. The only person in human history who had the absolute right to consider himself superior to others. To walk around saying, you're a sinner, I'm not. You should bow to me. You should bring me food. You should bring me money. You should bring me clothing. You should bless me because I'm in every way superior to you. He could have done that and He would have been within His rights. He could have snapped His fingers and roasted us all. And no one could have complained about that. And yet, instead, what did Jesus say? He said, you people aren't even capable of making a left turn. You can't follow the path of God. I've seen you. I've been watching you since the beginning. So instead of condemning you, instead of you just letting you wander lost, I'm going to do it for you. I'm going to live the life that you should have lived all along but were unable to do. And then I'm going to die the death that you deserve to die. So you'll have the power to do it. Jesus said, I did not come to be served. I came to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. And this is what doesn't get preached often enough from pulpits like this one. When Jesus saves us, does He save us from hell? Absolutely. But you've heard that. Does Jesus save us and rescue us from eternity separated from God? Absolutely. And that's worth celebrating, but that's not all. This is the part we don't talk about. He doesn't just save us from hell. He saves us from the selfish path we were on. And He gives us the ability to live lives of service to others. He teaches us to love others that way. See, you can't do this. If you walk away today and you say, okay, what the preacher said is, tomorrow morning I just need to try hard to be nice to people, then you've missed it. Because you can't do it. Not consistently. But if instead you say, tomorrow I'm going to wake up and I'm going to say, Lord, by nature I'm self-centered. No, it doesn't matter how long I've been a Christian. By nature, that's just who I am. So today, help me to think of others. Show me how to make a difference in someone's life today. And if you do that each day, if that is your path, then you're on the path of God. You're accomplishing His will. And that leads to very, very good places.